The field of analytical psychology has uncovered a profound truth. Some individuals possess a cognitive faculty so advanced it borders on the perilous. This capacity to perceive what remains invisible to others can either catalyze extraordinary personal transformation or lead to psychological disintegration. Clinical observations reveal that a significant majority of patients experiencing severe psychological distress exhibit a critical warning sign: the unwavering conviction that their own unconscious traits belong to others. Yet, an even more complex dynamic exists in individuals who possess an almost preternatural ability to detect falsehood, sense concealed emotional states, and decipher behavioral patterns that escape conventional notice. This faculty, termed perceptual refinement, is considered one of the most formidable discoveries concerning the human psyche. During a period of intense personal transformation in 1913, a pivotal case reshaped our understanding of human awareness. The individual in question demonstrated what can be described as raw, intuitive perception. She could enter any social environment and immediately discern deception, unspoken resentments, and hidden sorrows. Her clinical notes describe a remarkable proficiency for detecting the unconscious material of others, yet this ability was a source of profound distress rather than an asset. Conventional social interaction became a challenge as she perceived the artifice behind every polite exchange. Interpersonal relationships suffered because others felt intrinsically exposed in her presence. Professional stability was elusive, as her very being disrupted the unspoken collective agreements that enable group cohesion. The clinician realized this was not a case of pathology, but rather an example of what occurs when conscious awareness becomes too sophisticated for conventional social adaptation. When her insights were systematically verified, they proved to be exceptionally accurate. She described the inner worlds of others with the clarity of someone who had direct access to their private thoughts and motivations. This was not delusion. It was a form of consciousness so heightened it had become socially hazardous. Further investigation led to the exploration of a specific psychological phenomenon, wherein individuals with highly refined intuition become inundated by the unconscious contents of those around them. Archival notes from this period suggest there exist persons whose mental apparatus is so acutely calibrated that they absorb not just conscious communication, but the entire psychological atmosphere of their surroundings. Contemporary studies on sensory processing sensitivity provide empirical support for these early observations, indicating that approximately 1/5 of the population possesses a neurologically based predisposition for deeper cognitive and emotional processing. However, within the framework of psychological typology, a more specific category was identified: the introverted intuitive type, comprising a small fraction of the populace. These individuals do not merely experience emotions deeply, they perceive unconscious dynamics with startling lucidity. Their cognitive processing extends beyond overt social signals to encompass latent emotional states, repressed material, and psychological configurations invisible to most. They detect melancholy behind cheerful facades, perceive the anxiety underpinning confident exteriors, and feel the collective shadow that groups tacitly agree to disregard. The peril lies not in the perceptive faculty itself, but in the profound existential solitude it engenders. When one sees transparently what others cannot or will not acknowledge, one becomes a reflective surface that the collective finds unbearable to confront. This creates the dilemma of the superior function, where one's greatest asset becomes the source of their greatest suffering, severing them from shared unconscious participation. The true jeopardy emerged with the understanding that these highly perceptive individuals often become focal points for psychological projection. When a person's disowned aspects are reflected back through another's clear perception, the unconscious psyche faces a binary choice: assimilate what has been revealed, or assail the messenger. This pattern was documented repeatedly. The person who sees with clarity is frequently blamed for the very problems they merely illuminate. Patients with refined intuition consistently reported this experience. A gentle observation that someone appeared troubled would be met with accusations of being negative or instigating conflict. Expressing concern about evident issues would lead to charges of being hypercritical or inventing problems. This was recognized not as happenstance, but as a fundamental psychological defense mechanism. As one prominent text notes, that which irritates us in others can serve as a gateway to self-understanding. Yet for most it is far simpler to attack the person mirroring their shadow than to contemplate what is being reflected. This establishes what is known as the carrier phenomenon. Highly perceptive individuals frequently become the designated source of dysfunction in every group they join, not because they create issues, but because they reveal pre-existing fractures in the collective unconscious. The bearer of refined perception becomes the vessel for everything the group is unwilling to consciously acknowledge about itself. This pattern explains why such individuals don't just feel mildly misunderstood, they feel systematically persecuted by an inexplicable force. 4 distinct patterns were identified within this psychological type, each representing a different mode of processing unconscious external material. Pattern 1. The empathic percipient. These individuals combine introverted intuition with a dominant feeling function. They don't just comprehend psychological dynamics intellectually, they experience them somatically. They assimilate the emotions of others so thoroughly that they often cannot differentiate between their own feelings and those they have unconsciously absorbed. They exist in a state of chronic emotional resonance, perpetually experiencing the unexpressed sentiments of everyone in their vicinity. Pattern 2. The pattern discerner. These persons see psychological sequences and anticipate behavioral outcomes with remarkable precision. They could predict interpersonal failures, professional downfalls, and personal crises months in advance, not through deductive reasoning but through subliminal pattern recognition. They possess an exceptional capacity to foresee the logical endpoints of unconscious processes that remain opaque to others. Pattern 3. The somatic intuitive. These individuals could detect the physical correlates of psychological states in others, identifying illness prior to symptom manifestation, sensing exhaustion before it was admitted, or feeling the bodily strain indicative of emotional turmoil. They function as early detection systems for psychological and physiological distress within their environment. Pattern 4. The pure receptivist. The rarest classification combined introverted intuition with an underdeveloped auxiliary function. They perceived everything but struggled to organize or articulate their perceptions coherently. They existed in a condition of persistent cognitive overload, receiving immense volumes of unconscious data without the necessary psychological architecture to process it constructively. Comprehending one specific pattern is vital, as each necessitates a distinct approach to what was termed the integration imperative. However, understanding why this discovery was considered so hazardous is paramount. Observing the devastating impact of unrefined perception on patients led to the conclusion that seeing everything without proper psychological synthesis posed genuine threats to both individual and collective welfare. 3 specific dangers were identified. Primary hazard: collective cohesion disruption. The individual who perceives too lucidly jeopardizes the tacit agreements upon which social unity relies. When someone sees through the shared narratives that bind groups together, the silent consensuses to overlook certain truths, they become a destabilizing agent. Organizations, families, and societies operate partly through collective unconscious pacts regarding what will and won't be acknowledged. The highly perceptive individual unintentionally breaches these pacts merely by existing authentically. Secondary hazard: psychic alienation. Documented evidence shows how refined perception creates the dilemma of the superior function, when one's greatest psychological asset becomes the fountainhead of their deepest anguish. The burden of consciousness is that it cannot be conveyed to those who lack it. The individual becomes an isle of awareness in a sea of unconsciousness. This alienation is not merely social, it is existential. These persons often report feeling as though they inhabit a different reality from everyone around them. Tertiary hazard: ego dissolution. Most critically, it was found that people who absorb unconscious contents from others often sever connection with their own authentic identity. They become so saturated with external psychological material that they lose the ability to distinguish between their own inner world and what they are assimilating from their environment. This is a state where psychological boundaries disintegrate and the individual merges with collective unconscious contents. The danger is not simply social ostracism, but psychic annihilation. The total erosion of individual identity in favor of collective assimilation. Because unintegrated superior perception presented such risks, a systematic methodology was developed for maintaining individual identity while cultivating a conscious relationship with unconscious contents. Stage 1: Discernment and delineation. Patients were taught first to recognize when they were absorbing psychological material that was not their own. This conscious discrimination, the capacity to differentiate between authentic inner experience and unconsciously internalized external content, was deemed essential. The foundational task is to establish what is yours and what belongs to others. Without this delineation, individual development is impossible. The technique involved daily periods of absolute solitude, allowing assimilated material to settle, enabling recognition of one's own authentic psychological voice. Stage 2: Shadow assimilation. It was discovered that people who see others' shadows clearly often haven't integrated their own. The more one denies their own potential for deceit, self-interest, or harshness, the more disturbed they become witnessing these qualities in others. That which aggravates us about others can guide us toward self-knowledge, but only if we possess the courage to introspect rather than remaining externally focused. Shadow assimilation involves acknowledging that you embody every human trait you observe in others. This doesn't make you immoral. It makes you a whole person capable of seeing clearly without condemnation. Stage 3: Conscious engagement. The final phase involves conscious engagement with the collective unconscious, the ability to interact with the psychological contents of others without being overwhelmed or forfeiting individual identity. The synthesized person can act as a conduit between conscious and unconscious realms, aiding in making the unconscious conscious for others without compromising their own psychological sovereignty. This requires developing psychological vessels, the capacity to temporarily hold the unconscious contents of others while maintaining awareness that they are not your own. Historical figures were studied to distinguish between successful integration and psychological collapse. One philosopher possessed extraordinary insight into human nature, but remained fused with his superior function, rather than incorporating it into a balanced personality. His isolation and eventual breakdown exemplified what occurs when superior perception remains unintegrated. The individual is consumed by what they perceive, rather than transformed by it. Conversely, a medieval mystic converted his superior perception into wisdom that could nurture others without overwhelming them. He saw clearly, but communicated in ways that fostered comprehension rather than resistance. His success stemmed from conscious humility, the recognition that superior perception is the endowment to be shared judiciously, not an instrument to be brandished. Most significantly, the founder of this school documented his own struggle with overwhelming perception during his confrontation with the unconscious. He wrote of being threatened by a psychosis and credited his survival to his ability to comprehend what was occurring through his clinical work. His breakthrough arrived with the realization that his overwhelming perceptions were not pathological, but evolutionary. They represented consciousness, striving to advance beyond contemporary collective limitations. Because individuals with superior perception often encounter isolation, the critical importance of finding the few who comprehend was emphasized. Others capable of engaging with differentiated consciousness without defensiveness. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, but this privilege cannot be actualized in solitude. It requires validation from those capable of recognizing authenticity. 3 essential relational types were identified for the highly perceptive individual. Relational Type 1, fellow synthesized persons. The synthesized person recognizes another immediately. There exists a quality of presence, an authenticity that cannot be counterfeited. These connections often form instantly and intensely. You acknowledge each other as constituents of the conscious minority. These relationships are scarce but imperative for psychological survival. With fellow synthesized persons, you can be utterly authentic without apprehension of overwhelming or menacing them. Relational Type 2, those pursuing synthesis. Individuals actively engaged in their own synthesis process, through therapy, inner work, spiritual practice, can often accommodate superior perception without defensiveness. They may not possess it themselves, but they appreciate its worth. Those who have commenced knowing themselves can endure being known by others. Relational Type 3, innate receptacles. Persons who, while not possessing superior perception themselves, have a natural receptacle function, the ability to contain psychological content without being inundated. These are often mature individuals who have endured significant life adversities. A meticulous protocol for disclosing perceptive abilities was taught. Initiate with minor, considerate observations. Monitor their response pattern to feedback. Evaluate whether they become defensive or inquisitive. Progressively augment depth based on their demonstrated capacity. Consistently frame insights as contributions rather than declarations. The objective is not to find people who endorse everything you see, but to find people who can interact with your perceptions as valuable additions to understanding rather than threats to their self-concept. Because integrated superior perception benefits both individual and collective development, successful synthesis was viewed as crucial, not merely for personal well-being, but for the evolution of human consciousness itself. The individual has perpetually been the vessel of the living spirit, the entity who instigates change in society. Individuals who successfully integrate superior perception become culture bearers, people who facilitate the evolution of consciousness. The 4 planes of metamorphosis commence with Plane 1, acknowledgement without inundation. The initial transformation occurs when you learn to recognize your perceptive abilities without being overwhelmed by them. This conscious acceptance of the superior function is the commencement of wisdom, the recognition of what one genuinely is. Plane 2, synthesis without segregation. Learning to employ your perception constructively while preserving meaningful connections. This social individuation means the synthesized person does not retreat from the world, but interacts with it more consciously. Plane 3, contribution without depletion. Your perception becomes an offering you extend rather than a load you carry, utilizing your abilities in service to others without exhausting yourself. Plane 4, legacy without attachment. employing your perception to advance collective consciousness evolution without fixation on whether others recognize or accept your contributions. The synthesized person labors for the future, not for personal acclaim in the present. It was believed that individuals who successfully integrate superior perception perform an essential evolutionary role. They perceive what collective consciousness is not yet prepared to acknowledge, helping to ready humanity for necessary developmental strides. That which is not made conscious manifests as destiny. Highly perceptive individuals who master integration help render unconscious contents conscious before they materialize destructively in collective behavior. The path of integrating superior perception harbors specific perils. Extensive writings exist on psychological inflation, when individuals become fused with their superior function rather than integrating it consciously. Highly perceptive individuals often succumb to the oracle complex, believing they must rescue everyone from unconsciousness. This leads to moralizing, criticism, and ultimate isolation. Cases were documented where individuals utilized their superior perception to rationalize complete withdrawal from society. Authentic synthesis necessitates engagement with the unconscious world, not flight from it. Some highly perceptive individuals develop a dependency on being needed. They define themselves exclusively through their capacity to see and assist others, losing touch with their own inner development. Even successfully synthesized individuals can regress during periods of strain or trauma. Synthesis is not a permanent accomplishment, but a dynamic process demanding continual conscious attention. Ongoing practices for sustaining healthy integration were developed. Regular solitude for distinguishing your own psychological contents from assimilated material. Conscious choice regarding when and with whom to employ perceptive abilities. Continuous shadow work to prevent projection of your own unconscious contents. Connection with others capable of providing reality testing and support. Creative expression as an outlet for overwhelming perceptual input. Superior perception was understood within the context of collective psychological development. In the contemporary era, highly perceptive individuals might be detecting psychological patterns that elucidate collective behavior, environmental unsustainability before it becomes evident, or collective shadow contents requiring conscious integration. The sensitive individual registers collective problems first and most acutely. Their personal symptoms frequently mirror what the entire culture needs to address. The crucial insight was that superior perception serves evolution optimally when it is integrated consciously rather than endured unconsciously. The goal is not to be a martyr to consciousness, but to be a bridge between what is and what is emerging. The synthesized person serves the collective not by sacrificing their individuality, but by cultivating it so thoroughly that it becomes a gift to the whole. At the apex of development, individuals with superior perception hold their abilities lightly, seeing clearly without fixation on others, accepting what they see, perceiving profoundly without compulsion to rectify everything they observe. This is the transcendent function, the capacity to serve consciousness evolution organically, without coercion or proselytizing, simply by incarnating more conscious modes of being. Your superior perception is not a flaw in your psychological constitution. It is an advanced attribute of consciousness development. You are not defective because you perceive what others overlook. You are psychologically progressive. The question is not whether you should repress your perception to conform to collective unconsciousness. The question is whether you will cultivate the synthesis skills requisite to integrate your perception consciously. The individuation methodology provides a passage from hazardous isolation to conscious service, from overwhelming perception to synthesized wisdom, from psychological affliction to evolutionary contribution. You were born to perceive comprehensively, not to endure in silence, but to serve the evolution of consciousness. The world requires your insights, but it requires them delivered with the integration, sagacity, and strategic awareness that convert hazardous perception into cultural salve. Your gift is not your burden. Your unconscious relationship to your gift is your burden. Learn to integrate it consciously, and you become precisely what highly perceptive individuals were destined to be. Consciousness pioneers preparing humanity for psychological development that is inevitable, but not yet manifest. The jeopardy of perceiving everything is not that you see excessively. It is that you might never learn to perceive with the integration and wisdom your endowments necessitate. The world does not require more fractured empaths. It requires more awakened ones. If you identify with this description of the highly perceptive individual, you belong to a rare psychological classification deemed essential for the evolution of consciousness.